Elise, do I say the first thing first, or do we do announcements first and then the next? Okay, I got it. So we here's some important things that are happening for everybody in chat. And then we do this, and then we start. Is that right? Is that how we do that? I'm
That's
sorry
great.
for
Yeah.
all the. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Just getting stage fright for the first time in a while. All right. So, as you guys know, we are doing phone banking, and it is very important. So, please participate in phone banking. If you have any good phone banking stories, please share them in the chat because it is a fun experience and it really, really does make a difference. And also, here's some other super quick things that are coming up. We have an On the Historical Record event this Friday. It's going to be a little bit earlier at 6 p.m. Drew will be reading an Obama speech for the Affordable Care Act. So that will be really exciting and good. And you should come because they're wonderful. And then we have another super great thing, which is our Judicial Ecosystem series. We will be covering the Georgia decision. And if you have any questions about that, ACRAP is in the chat, so you can ask them. And so that would be really good if you want to learn more about the Supreme Court and what is happening. And one other super important thing. Oh, I didn't put it on there. All right, I will go over here. So let me get to my buttons. Okay, so also it's super important that we do our best to support our work wherever possible. If you guys can donate, if you don't have time, but you have a little bit of money, you can donate. It's not doesn't need to be much to make a big difference. And as someone who is currently waiting on my membership card for however long that takes, it is worthwhile. And every month when I look at my bank account, I feel really good about that $10 I give. So if you want to, please click the link. And ACRAB is totally right. You should come to the Judicial Ecosystem chats because they are really cool. And what's happening is really interesting. Let's see if there's anything else that we need. Oh, I took care. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the stream, Armand, and then I will introduce everyone and you.
Perfect. We're live. We're good. So yeah.
Oh, great.
I got your announcements as well. So yeah, please.
Okay. How lovely. Alrighty. So hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the third installment of Ivory Tower After Hours, where we bring academics and their research to our volunteers and the politically curious on the internet. Thank you for coming. There will be time for questions at the end, so be sure and put any questions you have in the chat. I will be working diligently to organize them for the Q&A portion. And with that, I am going to leave it to Armand, who will lead us through this process and hopefully teach us a whole lot. I'm sure that we will learn a lot from Chelsea. Okay, thank you. That's all.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, folks, hey, if you haven't met me, I'm Armand. I'm a data scientist and policy researcher by day. I'm a video essayist at the Armand Madani on YouTube by night. I'm super excited to be here hosting this installment of the Ivory Towers After Hours session with Dr. Chelsea Ebin. We are starting off with a little bit of a challenge for me because I have to go through your CV in short, which is no easy task, but here it goes. Chelsea is currently an assistant professor at Drew University. She teaches courses related to American politics, constitutional law, political theory, and gender. She's a fellow at the Far Right Analysis Network and has extensively studied far right movements in America from the 1970s onward, specifically focusing on Christian nationalism and the new Christian right. This year, I think actually in August, very recently, she published a new book called The Radical Mind: The Origins of Right-Wing Catholic and Protestant Coalition Building. Like I said, I am super excited to be talking to you today. So welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Excited and eager to have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we just dive into it? I'll start pretty broad. If it can be said to have one, what is the overarching goal of Christian nationalist groups in the United States?
If you would have asked me that 10 years ago, I would have given you a different answer than the one I'm going to give you now. Uh, I think now the goal really is dominion, right? The goal really is to uh, sort of establish control within the government and of the government, and to remake the United States in the image of a Christian nation and state. I think probably all of us here have heard folks say, like, the US was founded as a Christian nation. Uh, but when I say that they want to make the US a Christian nation, they have something different in mind than the sort of weird mashup of capitalist colonial enterprise and Puritans that actually existed at the outset of settler colonialism. Um, so what do they want to do? I mean, should I keep going? Do you want to know what that looks like? Or,
Maybe
uh,
maybe we could zero in and just kind of parse it out throughout the conversation. You mentioned Dominion, and I listened to an episode of Straight White American Jesus in preparation here. Is Dominion, is that what you were referring to as like daddy politics or a big daddy? Not that we need to justify the title of this stream, but is that what that is?
yeah, it is. Well, I think when I think of daddy politics, what I'm thinking of is a little bit different than Dominion. Um, because daddy politics is really the politics that wants to model the state on the sort of patriarchal, hierarchical, very authoritarian structure that they envision being the model for the family. So that's part of it. But I think often when we think about dominion, it is the sort of belief in an entitlement to shape and rule over, right? And the dominionists think that, of course, Christianity, uh, by definition, should and by right of entitlement should be the sort of supremacist structure. Um, and so lots of different kinds of dominionists exist where they have different ideas, but I think we can use dominion really broadly to just say, like, absolute control over.
That Yeah, I think that that makes perfect sense to me. And just like at a high level, before we get into like the moment that we are in right now politically, you mentioned a move, away from maybe the market led economic theory that kind of underlied the new right from before, and there's a little bit of a departure there. So what does that look like?
Yeah, I think so. When I think of what the Christian right wants, or what the Christian right is committed to ideologically, right? It's anti-liberal, it's anti-pluralist, and it's a little complicated, but I think it's fair to say it is for the most part anti-democratic, as we would understand democratic. And so, what I mean by that is some of the Christian nationalists are pretty down with the idea of democracy as established in the Constitution. They just think that it should only be for some people. And for those of us wedded to a like broader, more inclusive, egalitarian concept of democracy, that's not what we think of, right? Like, we don't think of uh, what we might call it like a Herrenvolk democracy, which is what existed in South Africa under apartheid, where South Africa was a democratic state if you were white, and everyone else was excluded.
I see.
And so this sort of, if you bring together the anti-liberal, the anti-pluralist, the anti-democratic strands of thought, uh, you don't necessarily have small government free market politics. You actually can end up instead with a politics that's quite big government, and exercises quite a lot of control over the market in order to ensure that your state looks the way you want it to look.
And so, I mean, that kind of plays into Project 2025 then, right? So you have your Christian nationalism and the goals that, as you've described it, and like Project 2025 aims to use the coercive ability of the government to kind of reach those ends. Is that correct? Is that how these two things are related?
Yeah, I think absolutely.
And what are some of those like coercive kind of mechanisms that Project 2025 lays out? I'm less familiar with it than I think you are.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time over the summer reading Project 2025. I don't recommend it. It's really long and has a lot of really bad ideas. Uh, but some of them, right? So I think I'm going to maybe take a step back and then I'll come back to
Yeah,
what you're
please.
asking. Right. I think a lot of the media coverage around 2025 has emphasized that it wants to deconstruct government, right? That it's this radical project to abolish the federal government as we know it. And that's only very marginally correct. Like the goal is to transform government, to abolish certain departments like the Department of Education, uh, but in the service of actually strengthening the executive branch. Right? So the goal is not like a weaker government, what we might think of as a smaller government. The goal is to shift power so that it's consolidated under the president, and to remove the checks that come from bureaucratic government, civil servants, right? So replace all of your civil servants with appointees, whose loyalty is to the president, and remove any of the sort of checks that might be sort of ingrained in the institutions. Um, so I think, when we start off talking about Project 2025, it's important to realize that they're not looking to just break things, right? I think the sort of Steve Bannon deconstructionism, is really, or like the accelerationist, sort of dudes in Hawaiian shirts thing. Like that's really attractive to the media because they're like, oh, look, they want to break shit. And that's sure, like maybe they want to break a little bit of it, but really they have a vision for what they want to create in its place. Um, Project 2025, right, in terms of some of the sort of things it wants to ban. It looks to ban porn, which somehow it conflates pornography with transgender folks. And so there's this like really slippery movement in one paragraph where it goes from banning porn to banning transgender folks. Um, and wants to, of course, expand the ban on abortion, limit access to reproductive healthcare, all the sort of usual things. But it also wants to do some stuff around using the government to promote and support particular kinds of social relations and particular visions of society. So there's one passage in Project 2025, under the subheading Sabbath Rest. And it says, God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. Moreover, a shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together rather than as atomized individuals and provides a healthier cadence of life for everyone. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism and secularism, especially for low-income workers. Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. That day would default to Sunday, except for employers with a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath at a different time. It like there's one reading of that where you're like, oh, so nice. You want to give workers like time and a half to ensure that they get a day off. And then there's another reading of that that's like, oh no, you want to impose from the top down using government observation of what is a religious commitment to believe that the seventh day of the week is for rest, right? So that's just one little example. There's a bunch of others. There's like a great line about the CDC closing down churches during the COVID pandemic. And it says, what is the proper balance of lives saved versus souls saved? The CDC has no business making such inherently political and often unconstitutional assessments and should be required by law to stay in its lane. Right, so again, here you have them sort of taking aim at the CDC to maybe potentially limit government, but only in order to expand government's coercive effects, right, through shaping the way in which we engage with one another.
So it's a bit of a question of social defaults, right? Using this coercive power to create social defaults as well. Is that a right reading?
Social default, yeah, social defaults, but social defaults that are enforced through policy, right? Tax breaks for people who are married with children, sort of benefits to encourage people, particularly people who experience pregnancy, to take more time off work in order to, I don't know, right? Their vision is of cisgender women who have babies and then fulfill their God-given role on earth to be mothers. And it's really looking to use the government to create conditions that facilitate and pressure people into acting out those roles.
Gotcha. And does that represent a change in strategy from the Christian right when you started researching them, which was in the time period in the 1980s, the moral majority, around about that time, and Paul Weyrich's like "get our man in office" strategy? Is that a departure or a continuation, or neither?
I would say it's a continuation, right? And part of this is like it requires us to take a little bit of a deeper look at the Christian right in the 70s and 80s and what they were looking to do. I think the public face of the Christian right with Jerry Falwell and even with some of the organizations promoted and created by Paul Weyrich were very much around electing moral leaders and ensuring that true conservatives were represented in political office. But the sort of deeper ideological commitment they had was to seize control of government, or to, right, seize control sounds a little bit strong, but we'll just go with it. But to sort of like get a hold of the reins of government in order to use it to coerce people into modeling the sort of moral, pure Christian nation. So I see Project 2025 very much as a continuation. And when I sat down to read it the first time, I was like, oh my God, I pulled this off my bookshelf before we met today. This little book from 1987, and it's called Cultural Conservatism Toward a New National Agenda. And it kind of reads like the, I don't know, 140-page version of the 800 pages of Project 2025.
We'll have to post that in the channel. I'm not sure if this is in that book, but in a recent interview, you made a pretty fascinating point that I think is related to what we've been talking about here about social organization. And I'm going to just read the quotes on my screen. You said you're, quote, not entirely convinced that the current integralist Catholic vision that really seems to be edging towards communitarianism is not also a form of socialist organization. It's just a theocratic socialist organization. Can you just explain what that means, or expand upon that for me? Because it kind of itches my brain in a very interesting way. I wouldn't think of that.
Yeah,
Please. Yeah.
spelling it out. So I think that's in part because it's a work in progress, and in part because maybe they still don't want to say the quiet parts out loud. But I think it is a move away from a sort of democratic, pluralist, liberal society and a move toward sort of these little, little Christian city states, right? Like communitarian theocratic city states that are incredibly homogenous and that are authoritarian and hierarchical, right? Sort of the structure of government being modeled off of the structure of the church. But at the same time, particularly for your conservative Catholics, there is a sort of baseline commitment to providing for social welfare. And this is distinct from your conservative Protestants, right? So it's why I said the quote you've read, I'm talking about Catholic integralists, uh, because there is this sort of commitment to the seamless fabric of life. And so you do have to provide for the social welfare and well being of your people. Now, your people is really important here because it is defined right as this kind of narrow, restrictive community. But in that regard, I think there for that community, I think there really is a desire to create what would look a lot like a socialist system that provides for the welfare and healthcare and well-being of its members.
That's super interesting. I was going to ask about kind of you drew the distinction between the Catholic and the Protestant movements here. Um, what are there like fissures in their vision for that society? And if so, kind of where do those fissures lie? Those breaks lie?
Yeah, I think so. When we talk about Christian nationalism broadly, we're talking about Catholics and Protestants, right? We're not making this distinction. And I had a conversation with someone from PRI that does a lot of the polling around Christian nationalism. And I was like, can you all add a question that would help us identify if Protestant Christian nationalists think Catholics belong? Because my hunch is that quite a few of them don't, but we don't have the data to support it. So it's just a hunch at this point. Um, but right, the sort of history, and I don't want to bore folks, but like the history of the United States is that there's a lot of antipathy, a lot of antagonism between Catholics and Protestants at the founding. It persists and sort of fits and starts all the way to the 20th century. There's a movement where they start to sort of come together, where they're united around opposition to communism with anti communist crusades. That breaks down when John F. Kennedy runs for president and anti Catholic sentiment kind of roars back to life. And then into the 1960s and 1970s, there's no longer tarring and feathering of Catholics, but there's suspicion and hostility on each side. And so what my research looks at is how they form a strategic political coalition. which means that it's kind of weird for me now, like 2 months after the book came out, to be like, yeah, I'm not so sure that coalition's going to hold in the future. Uh, like, spent all this time talking, proving that the coalition comes together, and now I'm like, ugh, not sure where it's going. Um, but that is because I think that they are united in working toward a very, very broad and sort of ill-defined common goal of making the US more Christian.
Hmm.
But now that they're like literally a heartbeat away from actually being able to do that, there's a question of what it looks like when you try and put it into place.
Hmm.
Uh, and once we start to get down into the more granular, detailed accounts of sort of what conservative Protestants are envisioning and what conservative Catholics are envisioning, they're not as aligned as the coalition would have you think.
I see. I see. I think we're peeking into kind of the groups involved in the lineage of beliefs and kind of the broader movement here since we went back in history. But I would like, before we move on, to I was calling this lightning round takes. I've gathered takes from around the internet and just talking points, but I changed the name of this section to speed taking. I hope you like it. I'm going to read these off, and I'd just love to get your response to kind of these popular talking points. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Do you want short response or do you want long response?
Can we do medium? How's medium?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I think you've already touched on this. Maybe this one we can be a little shorter on. But so, first one is Project 2025 outlines a plan for small government by defunding and dismantling the Department of Education. We're hard passing.
If we had a buzzer, we're going to say no.
That's I think that's
And
mid.
for reasons that I think I already
Yeah.
mentioned, right? It's really about consolidating power. It's about expanding the state's ability to surveil its people and to regulate their behavior. Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
so I would say not so much.
Okay. Hit the the doubt button on that one. Donald Trump and JD Vance have disavowed Project 2025 repeatedly, so it shouldn't be considered part of the establishment, right? At least.
Oh, I like this one. So I mean, I'm unclear on whether they've officially pulled the forward to Project 2025 that JD Vance wrote before he was selected as Donald Trump's running mate. Uh, but the fact that he wrote it, I think, is pretty clear evidence that there is certainly some affinity between the Trump campaign and Project 2025. But more importantly, to my mind, is that there's a really long history, right, of the Heritage Foundation being influential and in conversation, not just with Republican presidents, but with with the previous Trump administration.
Hmm.
Like, we already know that he has a relationship with Heritage, and with many of the other groups that contributed to Project 2025. A long track record of saying what is politically expedient. And so I don't know why we would give any more credibility to the idea that he has no connection to 2025 than we would to his claims that there are immigrants eating people's house pets.
That there's a whole other ivory tower section about that talking point waiting in the wings. I guess like kind of a sub bullet actually on that one since it kind of came up at the end of that response. Well, Trump just says what he needs to get elected, but if he were elected, he won't actually do it.
So this came up actually just a couple of days ago in a class I was teaching, and we were trying to sort of understand how we would plot Trump's political positions on an ideology on the sort of political ideology matrix. And what I kept hearing a lot was like, well, he says things, but he doesn't mean them. Um, and that's something that I think we have also heard a lot about the Christian right. There's sort of this attitude of like, well, they talk about the rights of the unborn, so they're liberal because they talk about rights. And at the same time, for the Christian right, like they've been telling us they are anti-liberal from the get. Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority in a book called Fundamentalist Phenomenon, wrote, right, like we see ourselves as the antithesis and opposition to liberalism. And so we should take folks at their word when they tell us who they are. I think Trump tells us who he is all the time. And based on the actions of his previous administration, doing things like, I don't know, banning people from majority Muslim countries from traveling to the United States, there's no reason to think he won't act on his threats or promises.
Okay. I guess like picking out a different part of your previous answer. This take is the Heritage Foundation. This is a long one. Sorry. The Heritage Foundation has fallen out of vogue amongst Trump and his inner circle since his first administrative term in favor of the America First Policy Institute and other think tanks. So this document outlines an incredibly maximalist position for attention, not to be taken seriously.
Um, so far we've been talking about Project 2025, the mandate for leadership, right? All of these policy kind of position white papers that are compiled. But Project 2025 has two other components to it, right? One is a playbook of executive orders, and the other is a very extensive vetting process for future appointees to these currently civil service roles that they hope to replace with appointed officials. So again, right, like they're planning to put this into effect, and they are taking steps to ensure that it can be implemented from day one with executive orders, with a full staff ready to go. I mean, that was one of the things that hung up the first Trump administration was they really weren't ready to transition. And so, there were government offices where people the day before the inauguration powered down their computers, slid their key cards under their doors, and left, and had never talked to anyone in the oncoming Trump administration. And so they were really starting from zero. This time around, they're not starting from zero. This time around, they're starting with an army of people who are ready to go.
That makes sense. I think you preempted my favorite one, but I'll give you I'll still read it. It, meaning Project 2025, mechanically could never happen, but I think you've answered that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something I hear a lot, not in my classes, but from colleagues who are political scientists who have so much faith in U.S. political institutions that they think that the courts will save us, or they think that the legislature will save us. And I think take a good hard look at the court, and it's not running to the defense of liberal democratic institutions or norms. Effectively giving Trump immunity from criminal prosecution isn't exactly an indicator that they're going to shoot down his plans to really expand the imperial presidency. And Congress is largely ineffectual, right? It can't pass a budget, let alone convict Trump of articles of impeachment. So I don't see either of those institutions as bulwarks against the plan laid out in Project 2025.
And lastly, more of an interlude before we get into the broader movement. Christian nationalism is not part of the mainstream in America.
So I pulled up maybe a couple of numbers. Uh, yeah, roughly 3 in 10 Americans qualify as Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. And so like 30%. But there are 5 states in which more than 45% of residents identify as Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, right? Or their responses would have them be grouped into these categories. North Dakota and Mississippi are both at 50%, Alabama 47%, West Virginia 47%, Louisiana 46%. I find it hard to look at those numbers and say it's not mainstream.
It's hard to argue with numbers like that.
Uh, and I'm not a quant person. I do archival research and historical research, and I talk to people, and I do discourse analysis. So I don't make the numbers, but I think they're really helpful to have. And yeah, they're pretty distressing.
I want to actually kind of pick and sorry, I know I keep going on tangents, but do you find that hard to square when I've seen polls about folks not going, to church, especially younger folks not going to church as frequently, or maybe identifying with religion in America just differently than 50 years ago? Do you find that hard to parse that concentration of people who would qualify as Christian nationalists and those types of polls? Or is it not surprising to you?
I No, it's a really fascinating phenomenon, right? That like as religiosity has declined, identification with Christian, although we weren't surveying for Christian nationalism before, but right, like we can see Christian nationalism going up, religiosity going down. And I think some, particularly the sociologists, are interpreting that as like Christian nationalism isn't really uh, religious. It is a political ideology. I would push back against that. I think like it absolutely is also religious. But you don't need to go to church to be wedded to a set of commitments about how you understand the world, right? So it is a religious worldview as opposed to religious practice.
That's an interesting distinction.
And I think that it's not really a surprise that we see uh, people become more forceful supporters and express more forceful Christian nationalist beliefs as they feel their influence declining. Right? So I think that there is also a relationship between folks who are like, oh, we used to be 25% of the population and now we're 14 and that feels scary. And so we need to say it with our whole chest. So I think that's also part of it.
Okay. And I guess I want to draw kind of a parallel here between this moment and maybe like the social change that was happening in the 1960s and up to when your research began. Would that qualify that increase in fervor with a decline in maybe religiosity to use your term? Would that qualify as backlash to you? Is this a backlash
Oh,
movement?
you're setting me up.
Absolutely.
Uh, so, so I'm really critical of the sort of discourse or the language of backlash. And I think it's probably the most like I don't think much of what I've written is all that controversial. Uh, but the chapter on backlash really pisses people off. Um, and I think that it is so we're really familiar with the discourse of backlash that says the right reacts to what the left does, and that is what motivates the right. And I think that that is a really comforting way of thinking of things, which may not be intuitive, but because then it says, like, well, we can anticipate what they're going to do, and what they're going to do is just try and revert back to the status quo. But I think that's a way of understanding right wing movements that actually has been promoted by the right because it keeps us from seeing what they're working toward and what they're building. And it allows them to claim the identity of being victims, right? It's what the left did to us that made us have to go out and do these oppressive or reactionary things. And so it serves a lot of purposes for the right to continue to say that they are backlash driven. And I think for the left, it allows people to feel less, honestly, less scared, right? Oh, we can anticipate what they're going to do. They're reacting. And I don't think either of those are productive,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that we can recognize that the right is going to seize on particular transformations or changes in order as catalysts for action, right? So it's not saying like they aren't in relation to or engaging with changes. Yes, declining religiosity, that provides an opportunity to kind of seize on the moment,
Mm-hmm.
to articulate a more robust, a more extreme vision of what the state should be. But in political science lingo, we'd say it's like capitalizing on an opening in the political opportunity structure, right? Conditions change, you see it, you act on it, you keep going. So I don't think they're backlash driven. I don't think that they're trying to get back to any particular point in time or that they're trying to conserve tradition. I think that they really have a pretty radical vision for transformation, and they're really proactive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I I imagine adopting that sense of identity and victimhood, as you've said, is a very useful recruiting tool as well. I imagine a lot of the groups that you've spent time with, and maybe we could draw those out in a second, are designated as hate groups, or what you've studied can be designated as hate groups that have ideas rooted in supremacy. Is that one of the ways they go about building effective voter bases or very animated voter bases at least?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it helps cultivate this like affective sense of belonging and membership. That's really important. And so, right, sort of allying and joining together as victims who are committed to self-defense is really powerful. Um, and I would say like this past summer I was at the Patriot Church, and there is this kind of undercurrent anger that permeates the discourse, that permeates the space. But there's also a lot of love, right? Like these are people who are genuinely very happy to see each other and in community with one another. And I think it's to our disadvantage to not recognize that they get a lot of positive benefits from joining together in these spaces that we might, right, or we do label as hate groups.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're places where they find community, they find like affective, you know, uh, belonging.
Mm-hmm. Um, this might be a little off, like on its own little tangent here. But do you think that or do you get frustrated with the discourse about these groups then, and perhaps like the left not addressing or trying to de-radicalize this segment of people in America? Or did you? Is that way too tangential for this? I'm just curious.
I think no, I think what I get frustrated with is the left failing to recognize where people are having their needs met in these groups. And that failure to recognize the need means that we aren't providing it on the other side, right? And so that's where I get frustrated is like if the left persists in viewing the right as reactionary, as motivated entirely by anger or a desire to dominate, which like those things are part of it. But if we don't see where people are also going to the right to find other forms of community, other types of benefit. I mean, it's the thing here, we're really going to go off topic, but it's like the thing with QAnon and conspiracy theories, right? They are so good at making people feel special and so good at making people feel like they are part of the cool kids club and they know the truth and they have a specialized language and rhetoric, and it is super attractive,
Mhm.
right? Like it gives people all of these like nice little, I don't know if it's dopamine or what it is, but like all these like good happy chemicals in your brain that are like, I belong. I know something someone else doesn't know. I'm actually the really smart, cool person in the room
Mhm.
who can decipher the Q drops or who knows that drinking pee is going to cure me of cancer or whatever it is.
Right, right. The collective decoding activities are a particular point of fascination for me. So I'm actually glad that we went off on that tangent. Yeah, I guess in the same vein, the way I view kind of the Protestant and Catholic movements, especially around like the pro-life movement, for example, is that they're very good at churning out these like single issue voter bases. But we've talked about how they have a bit of like different belief. They have some fissures. How do they kind of coalesce these into a coherent ideology that people follow, if they do at all?
Yeah, I think the very, very pithy short answer to that is pro-family politics, right? Is that that becomes the umbrella under which all of these kind of disparate, distinct single issues can be brought together. And it's also the umbrella that Project 2025 shelters under. Project 2025 says that its first promise is to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. And then it goes on to say that the next conservative president must get to work pursuing the true priority of politics, the well being of the American family. And so many things can be pro family politics, right? Gun rights are pro family politics because you need to be able to defend your little lady and your children from intruders. Uh, Education, pro family politics. Healthcare, pro family politics. Even things like business deregulation can become pro family politics, right? Taxation, pro family politics. So it's this really useful umbrella that can be sort of opened up, and then all the single issues can be gathered under.
That, that is interesting. And what we I want to focus on kind of the family element for a second. We've talked about tradition a little bit. We talked about the pro-family politics. Are the groups that you've studied, do they have like an era or like some historical past that they're trying to emulate in the future? Like, could it be said that they're just trying to go back to the 1920s essentially, or is that just reductive?
No, they choose different periods in time depending on the moment. So this was a this I spent some time talking to the head pastor of the Patriot Church, and it was the question I really wanted to get him to answer, right? Is I was like, because I when I first met him, I said, I'm interested in what you want to build. And he said, we don't want to build anything. We want to conserve. And I was like, okay, so what do you want to conserve? And he, sort of said initially, well, we want to go back to the foundations of the Constitution. We want to get back to the basic principles. And I was like, okay, so you're talking like 1776? And he was like, well, no, because slavery was bad. And I was like,
Agreed.
okay, so you're talking Reconstruction? And he was like, yes, but maybe we also do want to repeal the 14th Amendment. And I was like, oh, all right,
Fascinating.
that's a bold statement to make. And so I couldn't quite get him right to commit to a time, even when he himself is so wedded to the idea of being a constitutionalist, of wanting to return to constitutional principles. But when pushed a little bit, it gets it gets muddy very quickly. But then so after this conversation, then I listened to his next sermon, and he's talking about returning to the 1950s. Uh, and the sort of, atomic age, housewife in a pretty dress, uh, family wage, yada, yada, yada. Um, so I mean, I think that the point in time that they're always trying to conjure is one that never existed. Because we can go to each of these moments, and in each of these moments, right, whether it's 1776 or 1876 or 1976, conservative Christians have been bemoaning the sad ass state of society, and have always been discontented with our like moral turpitude. So my answer to you is I think what they conjure in their mind changes depending on the need they have at any given moment. But I think all of these conjurings are manufactured, are fabricated. They're not ever grounded really in an.
Okay, that makes sense. I've put up on my stream a definition that I think I saw in one of your articles, which is prefigurative traditionalism. Is that what we're talking about? Just like kind of muddying this past and trying to embody it for the future. So
Yeah.
it's a forward-looking movement, really. And I'm curious, where do you see this movement kind of going in the next 5 to 10 years? Is it maintainable?
I mean, so it is at the moment, right? It's many, many different movements. I think we see, right? Like you can look at the rad trad Caths online, the radical traditionalist Catholics online. You can look at cottagecore. You can look at Nick Fuentes and his little groupers, right? All of them are in some way cosplaying at this sort of traditional and or prefiguring what they mean by the traditional, right? They're trying to establish the conditions under which their imagined vision of the past. These are sort of examples, I think, of prefigurative traditionalist actions. Uh, what it looks like 5, 10 years from now depends on November. But even beyond November, right? It depends on um, finding a way to forge a viable alternative and a different discourse that is more attractive to people than the promise of a past that never existed when things were better.
And I want to stick on that point about this November. I think a lot of folks who might be becoming politically active in this election as their first one, they might view Project 2025 as a uniquely like Trump thing. But based on our conversation, these ideas aren't about a man, but like the vision for America. What's your message to those who might view a Trump defeat as a panacea to this?
Uh, I think I think there's one version where Trump wins and we have to deal with that. Uh, there's another version where Trump loses, but refuses to accept that, and we have to deal with that. Uh, and then there's the version where Trump loses and goes away. And Trump can lose and go away, and we will still have Christian nationalism, and we will still have J.D. Vance, and we will still have people committed to bringing about Christian dominion. Um, and Trump is, while I think he was a sort of necessary figure for transforming right wing politics in the United States, Uh, I think he's served his purpose, and he no longer is really all that important, because the right has reconfigured, um, and is mobilized around a very different conception of conservatism now than they were 12 years ago.
Well, I I think we're going to pause here. I'm going to thank you first of all for answering all those questions. Before we turn it over to chat, 'cause I'm sure based on that last answer, we'll have quite a few questions. So Elysium and Tomato, if you want to take it over, and I know we have a ton of things in the chat. Yeah, why don't we turn it over there?
Thanks so much for a really, I mean, I'm not fun. I know my
Well,
students the other day were like, "You're not funny and you're not fun." And I was like, "I know. I'm like a little like rain cloud with a vascular system." But
I had a
I
great
thought it was
time.
really
I
fun.
yeah,
So
I no, I
thank
learned a lot. Learning is fun. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. I don't see the rain cloud with a vascular system.
oh,
Uh, okay, well, we have some really great questions. John, do you have any thoughts before I go into questions? Also, yeah, please feel free to keep typing your questions. Otherwise, I will start with the questions.
We should just get to the questions. I'm super
Okay,
excited
yeah,
for them.
me too. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for being here, both of you. All right. Okay, I'll start with John's question, which was at the very beginning. At the start, Chelsea said her answer for what Christian nationalism's goal was 10 years ago would be different than now, Dominion. What did it want 10 years ago?
I think 10 years ago it wanted to its maybe its end goal was the same, but its sights were set so much smaller, right? Because it needed to establish the conditions for that to be possible. So 10 years ago, the Christian right was focused on the court, focused on getting justices who would overturn Roe versus Wade, um, maybe focused on state legislatures, and ensuring that they could gerrymander states in order to ensure electoral advantages going forward. But now they've done all that. And so the goalposts have shifted, right? Like now so much more is possible than was 10, 15 years ago. We also, I do think we sort of crossed the Rubicon with the January 6th insurrection, where it became clear that you could really fundamentally challenge American democratic institutions and practices, and that would maybe be okay. And that's really, that puts us in a very different place than where we were a decade ago.
That makes sense. Yeah. Um, Kind of wild to think about. All right. So this question is from A Crab. And I put it towards the top because I think it's a really great question. Okay, that made me sound like I was playing favorites, and I didn't mean to. To what extent are the theological commitments of these people sincere? Um, and then Hell Hates Demons also has a follow-up question to that, which is how do Christian nationalists reconcile when their ideas contradict with the Bible? How does that qualify as Christianity anymore?
Oh, great questions. Um, I, I'm going to say that of the Christian nationalists I've spoken with, I think their religious beliefs are sincere. When I spent the whole summer watching Patriot Church sermons, and right, that the religion is the defining foundational place they begin from. Not the sermons, but like the whole political worldview, right? And the sermons. But there was this moment, and I'm listening to a sermon, And the pastor starts talking about the rapture, which is, if folks aren't familiar, right, when those who are saved get sort of physically removed from the planet um, by Jesus. And the pastor is talking, and he's like, I mean, the rapture is going to come and we need to be ready. We should be doing rapture practice. All of you with trampolines, you should be jumping so that, when the rapture happens, you're not flailing around. And I was like, this has got to be a joke, right? Like, he's got to be making a joke. And so I hadn't had the video pulled up, and I pulled up the video so I could watch. And I was like, no, no, this doesn't appear to be a joke. Like, there's no laughter coming from the congregants. He's not cracking a smile. I think it's very sincere. And and I think that it's, again, it goes to the left's disadvantage to not take that into consideration, right? That when we're talking about Christian nationalism, maybe not for the all of the 30% of the country or all of the 50% of Mississippi, but for a good portion of those folks, their political beliefs are underpinned by a belief in um, trials and tribulations, the second coming of Christ, right? By like this eschatological vision of history. And if we don't recognize that that's part of what's motivating their political positions, we're missing a lot of the story.
Okay. Okay, good. My earbuds died. All right. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Here's another question from Hal Hate Stevens. After recent Supreme Court decisions, how does anyone in political science still believe in the American institutions of democracy? I think we could also include like the media.
I don't know. That's actually my answer. I don't know. Uh, I, there's a political scientist whose work I really admire and I'm in conversation with. And I saw him give a talk recently. His name's Joe Lowndes. His work's really, really good if anyone wants to look him up. And he was just like, the Supreme Court is an illegitimate anti democratic institution that we need to abolish. And I was like, yes. And so, I feel like the folks I'm in conversation with don't persist in believing that these institutions are legitimate or democratic as they're currently uh, as they're currently functioning, which is depressing, right? But it's like we have so much constitutional faith, so much fidelity to the Constitution in this country that I feel like many people are really resistant to the idea that maybe things don't work, that maybe those institutions aren't functioning 200 some years later, or that maybe those institutions were predicated on white supremacy and built on the back of the enslavement of other human beings and the exclusion of a host of other people. So there's lots of reasons why we should be critical of the institutions and be willing to recognize them as fundamentally flawed, if not, or at the least, flawed in their current articulation.
Awesome. I think Tomato's reconnecting.
Yeah.
Throw you the next one.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do Christian nationalists utilize religious rhetoric to navigate class struggle and promote their political agendas? And so, in what way does this mobilization serve the interest of the ruling class while potentially distracting from the broader socioeconomic issues?
Ooh. I mean, my off the cuff answer to that is going to be like prosperity gospel. right? And really, I mean, you can go back to Max Weber's Protestant work ethic and Calvinism, and this idea that if you work in a calling, you can identify that you've been saved through your success, right? Through capitalist success. And it's more modern articulations, right? This comes out through prosperity gospel, um, that, tells people that their wealth and class differences are ordained by God, right? That it is godly to be outrageously wealthy, that it is godly to have success, um, and that we don't need to transform our system of class oppression. The flip side of that is also, right, the sort of Nietzschean critique of Christianity that says that it encourages people to focus on salvation in the afterlife, right? To not resist the conditions of oppression that they face in the present, but instead to focus their sights on the next world. Um, so both of those things, I think, work in tandem to help uh, defang class politics and class struggle, and to create a theological justification for class hierarchy and inequality.
Okay, that makes super sense. Okay. Tomato, are you good?
I think so.
Yeah.
Sound okay?
Yep.
I just switched to my. Okay, so this is a good one. You've distinguished the Christian national. Excuse me, sorry, I know how to say that word. The Christian nationalist movement as not being reactive or backlist driven. Who or what are the driving forces for novel change? If that's too vague, we have others, but that's kind of like a good one in terms of like. I think this question is trying to get at like how to address them, or yeah, I don't know. Can someone let's get that one for now. It seems like maybe it's too confusing. Okay, and this one might go into this as well in terms of group.
I think that you're cutting out on my end, so I couldn't hear you asking a question. I don't know if that's just me and my shaky
A little bit.
internet.
That's okay.
it could be me.
I can
You
re-ask
do it.
Okay, we're good. You distinguished Christian nationalism's movement as not being reactive or backlash driven. So, like, what's driving the novelty development of it? What's the motivation?
I mean, the motivation is to, right, get power and control. But we all know that that's not a good answer. I if I can reframe the question a little bit, like why so much attention right now to Christian nationalism? I think that Trump plays a big part in that because of his willingness to break with established norms and to really break the institutions. But I think it's also that there's been a 50-year long game at work to reshape the court, to stack state legislatures and gerrymander districts, and that foundation has been laid. And so now's the moment to seize on it. I will also say that, I don't know, I should actually look at what the exact periodization is. But from the let's say even the 1950s onward, we've had these kind of episodic moments of heightened attention to Christian political activism. So 50s, Cold War, anti-communist crusades, lots of attention. And then end of the 70s into the 80s, moral majority, lots of attention. Then the moral majority and a lot of that sort of first round of institutions associated with the Christian right breaks down, and there's lots of hand wringing, like it's the end of the Christian right. Then we get Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition in the 90s. That gives us George W. Bush. He's a huge disappointment for the Christian right because he gives them many things they wanted, but it turns out that he is more, I mean, it feels wild to say this, but like he's more committed to democratic norms and not willing to like chuck the baby out with the bathwater. And so then we get this, like, in 2008, headlines that are talking about the evangelical crack up and the end of the Christian right and how there will no longer, I mean, I could give me 30 seconds and I can pull up a headline from the New York Times that says, like, Christian right no longer a force in American politics. And so it is episodic, is part of it as well. So I think that's, that's part of it. It's not even that it's that we're paying attention again.
Okay.
Because in that moment when they said that the Christian right was dead, like it wasn't. There was some conflict over coalescing around a presidential candidate. But that didn't mean that the goals had faltered or that people in the grassroots were any less committed.
Okay, you started on this. The follow-up to this is perfect, because the question was why. Yeah, why is this coalescing around Trump? Is there anything you want to elaborate more on there? Because he doesn't seem like he fits in with the rest of the values of this movement.
Yeah, he really doesn't have to, right? I mean, there's been a lot of creative theology to justify support of Trump. And some of it is the like, well, he's like King Cyrus and God is using him as a tool. And so he doesn't need to be a believer. He doesn't need to be moral or good because God's hand is on him. And why Trump and not someone else? I mean, really, because I think Trump has no fidelity to the Constitution or to even a coherent set of political ideologies, which makes him much more malleable, right?
Okay, makes sense. Our next question. Where do Catholics and evangelicals disagree when it comes to the pro-family politics coalition that you were talking about earlier?
Oh, so in the 1960s and 70s, disagreement really centered around birth control, right? And conservative Catholics like Paul Weyrich, who I write a bunch about and who lives rent-free in my head, he was very concerned that birth control would be a tool of population control and would be used against Catholics. And Protestants were, by and large, pretty accepting of contraception. So that's one place where they used to disagree. Where we're seeing that disagreement in like real time is around IVF and the kind of shifting positions on IVF. Opposition to IVF comes through Catholic theology, right? That it is life begins at conception, and so I'm going to like out myself as having bad science and not knowing a lot about how you make babies. But like you fertilize an egg, and for Catholics, that is a life. And that historically has not been how Protestants have thought about when life begins. But now we see some conservative Protestants also starting to oppose IVF under the language of like fetal personhood, right? Which actually, in a way, secularizes it, takes it a little bit out of the Catholic theology, and instead puts it into language that's more palatable and more familiar to Protestants. So that's one example of differences. There are others, but I think that's probably the most salient for our current politics.
Mhm.
And I want to just like put a little pin in saying when I'm talking about Catholics, I'm talking about traditionalist and integralist Catholics, right? Conservative Catholics, which are often very distinct from social justice Catholics, right? Progressive Catholics, Catholics who are deeply committed to immigration and supporting immigrants, right? A whole host of things. So I'm talking about like a little subset of Catholics, and the same for when talking about conservative Protestants. It's not all Protestants. It's those who have both conservative theological and political beliefs.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
Our next question is from Trey. Um, what are some of the downsides of the lack of community that churches use to provide more commonly, and how can we mitigate those or promote community and social cohesion without them?
That's a really, really good question. Um, I try. I know that I was talking about like affective benefits and how people find community and belonging. Uh, But I think, right, it can be a church or it can be a QAnon message board or a Facebook group for, I don't know, protecting your kids from queer folks, whatever it is, right? It doesn't have to be churches. I think the question is like, how do we foster those alternatives on the left? Um, and part of what makes community building, I need to maybe think before saying this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that part of what makes community building easier on the right is that it's not committed to egalitarianism and inclusivity. And so it's much easier to create a homogenous community of people who are aligned around a core set of ideas or beliefs. And it's much harder to do that on the left. And so, what do we do about that? I mean, I'm a terrible person to ask because I'm pretty socially awkward and uh, not not super social. So I'm like, I don't know where people find community. Like the dog park? I don't know.
Discord servers.
hmm
Bro.
This is community, right? This is actually an alternative space to, and a really good parallel. Um, I have had the chat closed, but I just looked up and saw one pop up that said public hobby spaces, and I think that's great. But I think also like libraries, right? I'm a huge, huge proponent of public libraries and public parks. And I live in New York City where our mayor has tried to defund our libraries. And got really angry about it because they're super, super important for providing space where people come together, not just in community, but also across different communities, right? And so you have interaction. And I think that's really, really important.
Nice. Okay. I think that's all. Tomato, do we want to do one more question or do we have any other ones?
Mhm. Okay. Do you want to? We could do the rephrase one. Okay.
I think
So
we hit it.
okay. Okay.
It's essentially asking the same
All
thing.
right. Okay. So I will go ahead and ask this question, and then Chelsea, you have to help us end on a positive note because this question is like it's me asking, and then just give us like some hope. Also, if there's any other questions, you can type them in the chat. But okay, so you did a really great job sort of explaining that it didn't matter that um, Trump is not really very Christian in terms of his values, and that it doesn't matter because he's a useful vessel. But could you talk about how the new apostolic reformation has like risen in power and influence under Trump? Would that be okay? If you don't want to talk about it, that's okay.
I mean, I can talk generally about it, but NAR is not, Matt Taylor's work is really focused on NAR. And so he's the expert. If you can get him to come on, that would be really super cool. But I think that, I mean, I can sort of speak broadly about how the sort of mandate to seize control of different arenas of life that is so central to NAR is one that is facilitated by Trump's willingness to do whatever serves him, right? And so I think that there's really a need to follow the money in all of this, which I haven't done. But I think so much of, Trump's maybe willingness to work with or allow NAR entry to positions of power is probably because it doesn't hurt his bottom line, right? It's these are transformations around, right? Like gaining control of the media, gaining control of industry, consolidating control of these arenas. And I think those are things that align with Trump's desire to consolidate control. It's not a great answer I'm giving you, Tomato. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's perfectly good. I did miss one earlier, so I apologize, DK. This is the last one. Any recommended resources for trying to de-radicalize someone? Or maybe that should be a whole other Ivory Tower series. But anything that you've seen in your journey that may be helpful.
Yeah, I think so. There's a group out of American University led by Cynthia Miller Idris called Peril, Peril, and they have put together a toolkit for sort of trying to help de radicalize, understanding and identifying signs of radicalization. So I would direct folks over to Peril because they're really the ones trying to equip folks with the tools they need to intervene. I mean, there's other stuff, right? Like getting people out of their like radicalizing algorithm spaces is helpful. I mean, it takes, a couple of years ago, I had students in a class do an assignment where they had to follow a right wing movement or a conspiracy theory on social media. And one of my students came in the second day and she was like, it took me 3 clicks to get from breastfeeding to Nazi mommies. And I was like, yep, sure does take you 3 clicks. And so, right, like finding ways of disrupting some of those networks and some of that, you know, uh, assuming that we don't end up living in a Christian totalitarian state, some of it would be around lobbying legislators to change policies regulating the way social media crafts its algorithms, maybe even changing some of the financial incentive structure that encourages the promotion and production of extremist content. Those are ways. But what I hear often are questions about, like, what do you do when it's a family member? Um, and that's really hard, right? When it's someone you love who has gone over to the other side, and I think I don't have good answers for that. I have a brother who's on that side of things, and I don't know how to get through and or how to change his mind. And really, some of it is like, well, there's I think a default position of like, but if someone knows someone, who has an identity that's harmed, they're going to be empathetic. That's not always the case. So I don't know. I think
That
countering
was that
disinformation.
was helpful. Yeah. It was. I had seen her somewhere. Like I saw her face and I was like, "Oh, I should look this person up later." And so I really appreciate you sharing that. The only other thing that I would suggest is there is a book called The Cult of Trump that a lot of people have found helpful. I haven't read it, but a lot of people say they like it. I think that's all I can think of. Okay, so I think that's it. Or I think we might be done, like right on time. Is it amazing or what?
Amazing.
Oh boy. Okay, well, I guess we should close. Well, John, I'll let you close this out. I just want to say
Okay.
thank you so much again. I was really, really happy with this the whole way it went. So, and also afterwards, we will be in chillin' and vibin'. So, if anybody wants to just sort of hop over there when we're done, you're welcome to, because I will be vibing and chilling. Okay.
Awesome. I'm going to put those phone bank links back in chat in a second. If you guys do want to get involved in this election, we still have 20 days of presidential election going on and all of the Congress positions. So it's going to be pretty big. We've got voter protection and House phone banks going on that are going to be competitive. The voter protection just switched to Pennsylvania, where they are trying to mark voters as inactive there as well, which just makes it very complicated for people to get an absentee ballot or to vote without additional forms of identification. So throwing both of those in there. And then the ending note that we like to leave with is for Chelsea. I think it's really cool if there's like, is there a book, a podcast, or an article related to these topics that you think could be really cool for people to follow up on, or if they're looking to get more into it?
Yes. So podcast, I'm going to say Straight White American Jesus is doing some of the best content right now. Articles, I would suggest checking out Kira Butler's writing in Mother Jones. And Phoebe Petrovich and Ava Kaufman have been doing a lot of great reporting on Christian nationalism for ProPublica. And then books, there are so many. Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers is really like a super accessible, good way of getting into this. Bradley Onishi, who's the host of Straight White American Jesus, his book, I think it's called The Coming War, Preparing for War, is also really a good, accessible way of getting into talking about these things and learning more about it. And then I will, if I can take one, I don't know, 60 seconds more to end
Yeah.
on a positive note. I think that the way we resist this is literally like it's doing everything you all are doing around the election, but it's also actively just not accepting it. I gave a talk in Kentucky a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked the same question, and I was like, fund abortion networks to get pills into Kentucky, ship them from other states, bring them, pass them out to people, like break the goddamn law, because it's a bad law. And I think that's especially the case when we think about attacks on reproductive autonomy, when we think about attacks on queer and trans folks, when we think about attacks on immigrants. Like, we don't have to accept it. We actually can just say no. And we can defend people, and we can stand up, and we can find ways of circumventing bad laws that harm people. So that's like my most positive encouragement is to just not accept any of it as a foregone conclusion, and to not accept the imposition of any of it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming out to talk to us, and we appreciate it.
Chelsea, it was great talking to you. That was awesome. Thank you
Super
so
fun.
much.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me so much time.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks, folks.
Yeah, if you guys want
Definitely.
to
Hey, yep, let's
continue
head over
hanging
to,
out.
sorry.
Yeah. No, yeah. Continue hanging out and chilling